just looking at the world from that high all day, every day, it does give you a very different perspective. I guess similar to an astronaut looking at the planet in the distance and going, oh yeah, that's the only one we got. We better start doing something and taking care of the people around us on it as well.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. Welcome, everyone. This is our very first episode of Creating a Cooler World. And I am happy and honored to have Pete Allum with us as our guest today. So welcome, Pete.
Hey, Scott. Thank you so much. I love the name of the podcast, by the way.
Thank you. Pete is a professional skydiver. And I think this conversation is going to be interesting both for skydivers and for people who've never jumped out of an airplane before and never will. Pete, if you don't mind, I'd like to share some of your accomplishments just for people who may not be familiar with what you've done. You started skydiving in 1979, and you have made over 36,000 skydives. And I'm going to say that again, just in case people who don't skydive want to make sure they heard that correctly. 36,000 times you've jumped out of an aircraft, or more than 36,000 times. People who don't jump might think that 100 jumps is a lot, and 36,000. Does it ever feel like kind of surreal to you to say that?
Not to me at all, because I've spent my whole life doing it, Scott. But I guess you could ask someone, like, well, I've hit a golf ball once. Surely that means I've done golf, you know? Mm-hmm. But it's not like that, is it? Once you find something that works for you, that sticks, you want to keep doing it.
Yeah. 21 times. You've been a member of a team which has won first place at the British National Formation Skydiving Championships as recently as 2016 and going back to 1985. So 21 gold medals from the British National Formation Skydiving Championships. You also competed in Italy, and you've been a member of the first place team at the Italian National Formation Skydiving Championships 7 times. And how did you get involved with the Italian team?
Well, have you ever been to Italy?
I have not.
Okay, well, it's your loss, Scott, because Italy is a beautiful country. The food is good. The people are amazing. And I was asked to, basically. I'd retired from the UK skydiving team, and the Italian said, hey, Pete, you want to come and be Italian for a while? Because I'd been making friends in Italy for a while. I'd been doing some work there. I'd been coaching, running seminars. And I built up a pretty good relationship. I'd even learned to speak the language. And so, yes, it was a very happy 7 years working with the Italian team, the formation skydiving, but also the canopy piloting side of things with the Italians. And I still keep a very strong connection with Italian skydiving to this day.
You've also been a medalist at the Skydiving World Championships and World Cup Championships 3 times. And you've coached national teams from Australia, Denmark, the UK, Finland, Italy, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, and the US. Oh, you're going to add something to that?
Well, there's a couple of other countries. Like Estonia is one country that I feel particularly proud to have coached because it's where my mother came from. And not many people even know that Estonia is a country, but it's a beautiful place on the Baltic Sea that I was there quite recently. And it has a very strong skydiving family, if you like, there. Yeah.
And that's interesting. That's kind of an interesting segue because I know both of your parents are skydivers and you grew up on a drop zone, which is a parachute center, an airport where people skydive for our non-skydiving friends. That's what we mean by drop zone. I'd love to know more about that. What was that like coming from a skydiving family and growing up on a drop zone?
Well, my mum and dad literally took me to the drop zone as a 6 or 7 year old, and it just became another place to play. I met some friends there. We had a good time. And as I grew a little bit older, I became a little bit more nerdy about skydiving and would draw pictures in my book at school, just waiting for the weekend to come when I could be back at the drop zone, not even as a skydiver, but just somewhere to play. So it was just very natural that I eventually started jumping. It wasn't a question of if I was going to do it, it was when. And so it was with quite a bit of surprise at the age of 15 when someone said, well, how about today? And off we went and did the first jump. So yeah, it feels good to be part of a skydiving family for sure. And also I have 2 daughters, one of which is a skydiver as well and works within the industry.
So were you one of those kids that I'm thinking of, like my friend Jimmy Tranter, who also grew up on a drop zone, and wondering if you were one of those kids who like knew how to pack a parachute before you knew how to drive a car?
Oh, completely. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And what's this other thing you're involved in? This, what's it called? Flight One? What's that all about?
Well, I could actually blame you for that, Scott. So for those of you who've heard of Scott's previous life, he was a skydiving instructor and coach for many years. And it was a real inspiration to a lot of us in the canopy coaching community, because I think your course, Scott, kind of set the standard in the early day of how canopy flight was coached. And what I mean by that to the non-skydivers, it's once you've learned how to skydive and you can basically steer your parachute down to a soft landing, there's a lot more to learn about the mechanics of how a wing works. So when I had about 15,000 jumps, so that would have been in the late 90s, I attended one of Scott's canopy courses. He then took me through my paces and just opened up a door and got me really curious about the process of how to fly a canopy and how to teach flying a canopy. And a few years after that, I joined Flight One, which obviously you're very heavily influenced and part of in the early stages. And I'm now a canopy coach along with 70 other colleagues all over the world, teaching to military and civilian. And it's about 50% of what I do, teaching that side of stuff.
About 50% is canopy coaching now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was very honored to be involved in the early days of Flight One. And I was talking about this on another podcast recently where I was a guest, just very excited and honored and proud of what all the Flight One instructors have done with the organization in all these years. Like every once in a while, ever since I've kind of left the skydiving world myself, but I'll check back on the Flight One website and go, wow, Kaz Shiki is a Flight One instructor now? That's so cool. Pete Allum is a Flight One instructor now? That's so cool. Like all these people that I, knew and respected over the years, to see y'all involved is really cool.
Yeah, and I wouldn't mind stretching that out a little bit, because someone asked me today, I was on the drop zone today, finishing up a student. We had good weather yesterday, decided we'd do a couple more jumps this morning. And I was chatting to some other skydivers that I know, and they said, why are you part of Flight One? And I was like, well, I could be Pete Allum canopy coach, but there's just so much more to offer coming from a company like Flight One. I have all my colleagues that I can draw on. We have the infrastructure, a curriculum that it gets constantly analyzed and assessed by all of us. And so there's a real changing curriculum. We're always trying to make it bigger and better and more efficient. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be part of something like that.
That connects with a theme that's come up in a number of different conversations I've had recently about the difference between what we can accomplish individually and then what we can accomplish as part of a team or as part of a group. And I mean, that was the origin of Flight One, right? I was doing my own canopy coaching and the guys in the PD Factory team were doing their own thing, and we decided we could accomplish more by working together. Maybe that connects with what we're here to talk about mainly. The reason I'm excited about talking with you today for this podcast episode is because the work that you've been doing to explore ways of making skydiving more sustainable. And you have a YouTube channel called Future Proof Skydiving. So I wondered if you would you'd tell us more about that.
Yeah, what got me going on that was even before the pandemic hit, I was looking at our sport and wondering how long we could keep operating for. I was seeing sports or a transport that causes lots of emissions. It's going to become harder for governments to say yes to allow people to keep on doing it. Now, I love skydiving, and I would also like to have the planet in a decent state, but I'm aware that our sport doesn't do the climate any favors at all. We're burning emissions on our sport. Also, to get to the drop zones, the equipment that we make is made out of nylon, so it's also petroleum based. And so I was thinking, well, what do I do? Do I quit skydiving? Do I become a base jumper? Do I go paragliding and then just ignore the last 43 years of my life, or just use it in other areas? And I thought, well, before I do that, because it always still is an option to do those things, why don't I start looking at ways that we can future-proof the sport? And at the time, I was working with Allegra Nassi from the Carroll Foundation, and she was super interested in what I was talking about. And she said, well, look, if you want, use my platform. I have the Carroll Foundation as a platform. You can use it. You can create a YouTube channel around that. And she gave me a nice little kind of hand up, and I would say some stimulus to start looking into it. And then the pandemic hit, which for me put me at home, which I'm never at home. I'm always on the road. I'm always traveling. I'm on the drop zone. My brain's going in a million different areas. And like a lot of people, I chose to use that opportunity to dig a little deeper into things. And so I started thinking, well, why don't I look for people who are actually making a difference right now? And I know there's not a emissions-free drop zone, a sustainable drop zone happening, but what would it take to do that? What would be the various elements? And maybe there's someone that has an aircraft that's working towards zero emission. Maybe that someone has a sporting environment where all the energy comes from renewable resources. Maybe you can start looking at all those different areas and then bring them together, in my mind at least, on a drop zone. So that was the stimulation for me starting that YouTube channel, if you like, or not even that. I would say it gave me the stimulus to pick up the phone or send that email and try and get hold of interesting people that were actually making change and had some projects that I thought would be applicable in the skydiving world.
It seems like a really valuable thing to do, to just ask that question, what can I do now? We were talking about this a little earlier. Like, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a government official. I'm not the CEO of a large corporation, right? And we often think, well, what can one person do? But that's actually the really important question, right? With the skills that I have, with the connections that I have, with the abilities and the experience that I have, how can I apply that to this very important problem that we're all facing right now? And it's what you're doing with this future-proof skydiving and leveraging your experience in the sport seems like a really good example of exactly that.
Yeah, well, actually, that was my foot in the door. And like you say, I have nothing to offer from a scientific level. I left school at the age of 15. My education has been very much on the road through working with teams, coaching people, a hands-on basis. And I thought, well, what do I have to offer? Well, the only thing I have to offer is a foot in the door with regards to my sport, the ability to use my computer to get in touch with someone, and all the wonderful tools that we have at our advantage right now that a lot of the times feel like they're distracting us, but actually I'm finding if you can leverage them, they'll start to work for you as well. And you know what? Where it's taken me has been in a fantastic journey. When if you have a problem, something that you want to resolve within yourself, what you tend to do is you tend to research the hell out of it and become an expert in that field. And I see that all the time. Someone who becomes a very good public speaker is maybe because they hated the concept of even standing up in front of everyone. So they studied it, they learned how to do it. Or let's say a psychologist, someone who's literally struggling with the way their own mind works, now goes and studies it, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so with that, it's as you say, it's open doors. It's put me in touch with people that are experts in their field and have given me, right now, I feel like I could build that drop zone. Apart from the technology of the aircraft, which is getting closer day by day, I feel like the pieces are in place if we had the ability to actually find a venue and the money to make it happen.
One of the interesting things about what you're doing is, you're educating people, you're sharing this information about the people who are out there working on this problem, creating solutions. And it's all very relevant to skydiving, but you're also sharing information about what's going on in the aviation industry in general. So much of our lives, whether we realize it or not, is dependent on aviation, from transporting goods, transporting people. And I'm wondering, what are some of the interesting things that you've learned, or maybe important things that you've learned just from doing the work that you've been doing?
Okay, so we'll stick with the aviation side of it first. The first thing I've realized is that carbon offset is a loss leader. Not only is it the last thing we should be doing, but even if we do it, it's probably creating more harm than it is good. And so if you feel like your offsetting is doing something to save the planet, it's really worth thinking about doing something else. And that's through talking to a lot of people in different areas who actually know the science behind it and are researching into it. The other thing is, on the aviation side, is one of the first people I interviewed was Rio Ganzarski. At the time, he was working with Magniex, which is the company out in the west of the US. And they had developed an electric motor that was put inside a Cessna Caravan, which, as you know, Scott, is is the aircraft that is used within our industry. I mean, it's a single engine aircraft turbine. It takes between 14 and 19 people to 13,500 feet very efficiently, very safely, all over the planet. And it is the most prevalent in skydiving operations. And so they put an electric motor in that Caravan and they flew it. And it worked wonderfully. But there was a full stop after that. What Magniex then started doing was working heavily on the motor development. And now what they do is they supply electric motors to other companies. And that then led me into getting in touch with companies like ZeroAvia, who are working on a electric hydrogen engine from fuel cell, and then a company like Ampere, who have a hybrid electric aircraft right now. And so in the world of aviation currently, there's been a bit of a race to find out what's going to work. Where does everyone need to spend their money, their time investing in, and create the infrastructure? When I first posted the interview about Electric Caravan, I got loads of phone calls. People are like, I want one. How do I get it? But it would only fly for 20 minutes on that current charge. The battery was so heavy, or is still so heavy, that it reduces the payload. So we would have to take less skydivers. Yes, it would be quiet. Yes, it would be more efficient as it goes up into altitude because it's not relying on oxygen for the fuel, etc. But until battery weight and charge time improves, a pure electric engine is not going to be the solution for now. It may come eventually. So then the hydrogen engines. Hydrogen is on everyone's lips right now. It looks like it could be one of those potential alleyways. And it is. I mean, ZeroAvia, for example, I don't know if you followed them. They have just completed a 10-flight cycle on a hydrogen electric engine. What they have is a Dornier 228, which is a 19-seat commuter-style turboprop. They have a standard combustion engine on one side and the hydrogen fuel cell engine on the other. And they've just flown it. They've done 10 missions with it. They've done all the testing. They're very happy with what they've done. And we're now looking carefully to them to see how the certification process goes. Because what seems to be the stumbling block, well, you know aviation, Scott, you know how hard it is. If something goes wrong with an aircraft, instead of just going down the garage and getting the guy to fix it, we're talking about something with 10 extra digits on the end of it, and it needs a seal of approval from an A&P guy and everything. So once the certification happens for that hydrogen electric engine in that airframe, that then opens the doors to retrofitting it into others. So we're all looking really carefully towards that certification process. And then just moving on to Ampere, for example, and I'm talking about two of the biggest players right now in aviation. They used what they call the electric eel, which is another Cessna-based retrofit, and they've done thousands of hours on that hybrid engine. So it's a battery combustion engine hybrid. And what they're offering, their website says they are taking orders for hybrid electric aircraft. Now, I had a recent chat with them because someone was quite interested in maybe buying a Cessna Caravan and retrofitting that engine. But the payload would be less, the ceiling would be a little bit less for now. And it felt like the electric engine wasn't quite powerful enough to do it on its own. And the fuel output on the combustion engine wasn't quite going to work out in our favor because they were insisting that they wanted to use SAFs, which are sustainable aviation fuels. And I'm not a big fan of that. I don't see how that's going to help us in the long run. And I'll get into that why in a second or two, maybe. But maybe you have some questions over something that I've said.
You brought up some interesting points. You mentioned the Cessna Caravan, which is an extremely popular skydiving aircraft, but that's also a small commuter aircraft. And I know it's used very heavily, or at least was, by companies like FedEx for delivering cargo. If you go to an airport, as you're taxiing out on your flight to go to somewhere, you might see a small single engine plane with FedEx on the side. That's likely to be a Cessna Caravan. There's so much overlap between, what you're talking about in the skydiving world and, again, the things that impact people's everyday lives without us even noticing. It seems like these are really interesting first steps, and any progress in this, almost like any progress is exciting. The Wright brothers, when they flew their first plane, they weren't disappointed. They weren't saying, oh, this thing will never make it across the Atlantic, right? And they just flew that plane and they had their, short flight that made history. And it's really interesting to think that it was only 60 years later that Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, right? We were landing 60 years.
That fact always just completely blows my mind. Yeah, that it is only 60 years. Yeah.
Yeah. And just that as an example of the pace that technology can advance in aviation. And it makes us think of these opportunities that we have. And if the desire is there, if the effort is put forth, how fast progress could be made.
Yeah. And that's why I was kind of approaching the companies saying, look, how about once you have a certified aircraft, we test it for you within our sport. We have a drop zone where you can do stop-start missions from the same runway. And that's kind of my angle when I speak to some of these companies. And we've had very, very positive responses from every single one of those companies. They're really keen to have partners involved. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, I know I saw one of your YouTube episodes was talking about someone jumping from an electric aircraft. How often has that been done? Have there been test jumps? Have there been, what is the actual status right now of people jumping out of electric or some of these, using some of this technology we're talking about?
Okay, well, to my knowledge, there has been a handful of jumps from electric aircraft. There's probably been a couple more under the radar because you know what it's like. Sometimes to get things done, you have to turn and look the other way. But Raphael Domjon, who is the head of Solar Stratus project, he was the first person that I'm aware of that jumped an electric aircraft. And it was an aircraft that he designed and he had been flying up to that point. And it's a solar powered electric aircraft. Get that. So it's not going to be the aircraft that is going to be our jump aircraft for long term. And it was wonderful interviewing him because he was the person that said to me, he said, and this goes so well with your podcast title, he's like, who wants to be around in a future where we can't have fun? He said, I want there to be cool things to do. And I want to help create a future where we can continue to enjoy ourselves on this planet. Something that I can look forward to saving as well. And then apart from that, I recently interviewed a Norwegian friend who had jumped one of the Pipistrels. The Pipistrel is an interesting aircraft. Interviewed Françoise Hellman. And she's part of a company that is running a flight school in the south of France, who I'm very excited to go and visit very soon. And they're operating the Avis Pipistrel, which is a very small two-seater aircraft that can be used for basic flight training. And they're hoping to run their whole. This goes really well with the drop zone idea. Is they have solar panels all over the airfield, and they have the battery charging unit there, so they actually renewably charge their flight school aircraft on site. And this Norwegian fellow, he jumped the aircraft once, maybe twice. So not so many. And in fact, if you have any listeners out there that would like to disprove me, that would be wonderful. I'd like to get more information if anyone has been out jumping electric aircraft.
I was just watching that episode this morning, episode 14 on your channel with Françoise Hellman, and was very interested. One of the things I was going to ask you about was that flight school that they're operating. They have the solar panels, able to charge these small electric aircraft and use that for basic flight training. It sounds like some of what you're looking at is not just the aircraft themselves, but also the general operations. Like you're talking about operating an entire drop zone, and how can we apply some of the existing technology, solar technology, to run a business in a more sustainable way. So would you like to talk more about that?
Yeah, the infrastructure. And you see, this is where we need to get a head start, I think, is we could create the self-sufficient drop zone ahead of the aircraft being ready. And let's prepare the ground. That's kind of my vision, is get as many drop zones as possible involved in reducing their environmental impact outside of the aircraft by having solar or wind or biogas to work their energy for the infrastructure, creating a waste-free environment as well, working with local farmers and businesses to share resources, to create something like a microgrid around a drop zone. And this is where one of the episodes with Richard Burt, Captain Richard Burt. So Richard, again, it's funny who you meet in the world, but Richard was a British skydiver who I met back in the 80s. He moved to America. He became a fireman, Las Vegas fire chief. He now teaches fire safety all over the world, especially with regard to resilient solutions for fire stations. He has been to areas that have had natural disasters and set up an infrastructure working on sustainable energy, so either wind or solar. And he uses the fire station as a base with which to create that central microgrid. And I can see us transferring that technology to a drop zone where, as I said, we use whatever resources we have close to us, whether it's sun, wind, biogas, the local community for food, and also a working environment as well to incorporate the locals. So let's work on the infrastructure first so that when the aircraft is ready, we can just start running it from there.
That seems like a really interesting opportunity because I'm just thinking, like in the case of a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, a fire, we hear about, for example, like the wildfires out in California that we've had in recent years, taking down the electrical grid, right? Yep. You have, electrical poles, electrical wires that are coming down. So the ability to set up first responders using wind power, solar power, whatever's available, get those services in place. So you have medical care, so you have firefighters and EMS able to do their job. But then also, while the traditional infrastructure is being rebuilt, there's the opportunity maybe to help people resume their lives or survive using some of these newer technologies.
Yeah.
It seems like an interesting opportunity.
Completely. I was just at a drop zone in Germany last weekend, and the drop zone chief instructor was driving me back to the train station in his Tesla, and he was telling me how at his house he has sufficient panels to charge his car so he can drive for free everywhere, and he can completely run his household, and he's a family man with 2 kids, on those solar panels. So he's created his own little microgrid. It's not too much of a stretch to feel like we could do that for a drop zone or another business.
Right. Yeah. I know one of the challenges right now is people still needing power at night when the sun is down, and that creates an awkward situation for the power companies because demand becomes lower in the day. They have to ramp back up at night, and power plant is not like a lawnmower. You can just pull the cord and start it up again. But it seems like battery technology or some type of storage technology is becoming an important part of that equation. It reminds me of talking about the batteries in the electric aircraft. I know there's a company called, I think it's CATL, a Chinese company that recently announced a major advancement in energy density, so the ability of a battery to store energy. I know some of the discussion around that is how it may apply to aviation and, electric aircraft. I'm wondering if you've heard anything about that. Is that a topic of conversation that comes up? Do you know anything about that?
I have heard something about it. I did start to look into it, and it is something I would like to learn more about because, as you said, the Wright brothers to Neil Armstrong standing on the moon being 60 years, if we're already getting this information filtering through about low-density, high-charge batteries, then that's one of the things I'm going to be looking into very, very soon for sure.
I know I'm reading a couple articles about it. There's a lot of optimism about it, a lot of guarded optimism about the CATL announcement because they're a very reputable company. They've been apparently making batteries for a long time, but some people are being cautiously optimistic until they're actually seeing working models.
Absolutely. I mean, let's see it running a model aircraft around first, please.
Yeah. Which seems important because I think as we look at some of these issues, it's really important to maintain a balanced perspective. We want to be excited about the new technology. We want to be excited about the new opportunities, but we also don't want to be prematurely celebrating something that's not quite there yet, it seems like.
Yeah, I don't think we can relax quite yet, Scott. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of work to be done out there. And I'm by nature an optimistic individual, which is good for me a lot of the time. But I do have to temper that. And a lot of the time, that's where my family and friends help me out. They're like, tell me a bit more about this. And it forces me to dig into it a little bit. And I've done that with a lot of the companies that I've been interviewing. I hear this vibrant optimism coming from the CEO or the head of marketing, etc. But then afterwards, I'm constantly monitoring. And so the companies I've talked to you about are the ones that seem to be continually putting the effort in to get to the next stage. Yeah, there's a company in England right now who are working on a hydrogen aircraft, a Britten-Norman Islander, which I don't know if you've heard of Britten-Norman Islanders. Again, it was the Cessna Caravan in Europe maybe 30 years ago. It's only a 9-plate aircraft, but it's twin engine, and they're currently working on a hydrogen model. So I'm excited to see if we're going to see some progress in that field. And I'm meeting up with a guy this summer when I head back to the UK.
Excellent. One thing that may be useful for people who are maybe interested in sustainability, in climate action, but haven't learned a lot about it yet, just the whole idea of when we talk about something like carbon footprint. And again, I was watching one of your episodes. It was episode 2 with Jasper Vandermeer.
Yeah.
And I think he did a good job of getting into this. But the idea that, and this is maybe going to be a little bit of a basic explanation. So, and please correct me if I get any of this wrong. But what we're talking about here, like when we talk about carbon footprint, is if I was to get on an airplane here in Raleigh and fly to New York, that airplane, those engines burning jet fuel are going to produce a certain amount of carbon dioxide and put that into the atmosphere. And that airplane and all the other airplanes and all the cars and all the factories and power plants that are putting this carbon dioxide and these other these other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. It's the combination of those greenhouse gases that's causing our atmosphere to retain more heat than normal, which is causing the planet to warm up. And that's a lot of what we're talking about with carbon footprint. Is that correct? Did I get that correct?
Yes, I'm not a scientist, but I think you've done a really good job of explaining it better than I could right now, actually. Well done.
Thanks. Yeah. So that's what we're talking about. And it's interesting, like in that one episode with Jasper Vandermeer, he was talking about being able to calculate. So on that flight from Raleigh to New York, how much carbon am I responsible as one passenger on that plane for putting into the atmosphere? If you take how much is produced by the airplane, divide it by the number of passengers, et cetera. So for a single skydive in a traditional, fossil fuel powered skydiving aircraft, how much the average carbon output is. Do you find a lot of people are talking about that now? Has that become a more common topic of conversation in the skydiving world, or a lot of people still staying kind of blissfully ignorant of that?
The majority is the latter, I would say, but every so often you get an engagement from someone, and there is actually a website called myskydivingfootprint.org, which I just got up in front of me when you started that part of the conversation. And what you can do is you can put per jump, let's say for 250 jumps from a Cessna Caravan, for example, would be 2,728 kilograms of CO2. The equivalent from an Mi-8 helicopter would be 3 times that amount. So once you start to give people those figures, they're like, oh, so it is a lot of fun jumping out of a helicopter, but if I want to keep this sport going into the future, maybe I need to adapt my behavior a little bit. And so I find that a very useful metric to tell people, like, please keep skydiving, but let's try and do it the most efficient way possible. And if I can use a third of the amount of emission in order to make my skydive, why not do that instead? So it is, I am finding it a useful metric to help people make decisions. Yeah.
And I found that episode, it's Future Proof Skydiving, episode 2. I found it really interesting just the way you all were talking about that, because it's almost like the way we talk about money. So like if someone travels from Europe to the US. Yep. And back, that would be like equivalent to making 400 jumps in terms of the carbon footprint. And we can kind of think about it the way we might say, well, if I wanted to go to Europe this summer, it's going to cost me that much. And do I have that money? Do I want to spend that money? Or would I rather spend that money in a different way? And we can talk about our carbon footprint the same way, not saying, no, don't do that thing that you enjoy, that's fun, but thinking about it the same way we might think about spending the money. Is it worth it to spend the money on that? Or is there a more beneficial way for me to spend the money, and maybe that I'm going to enjoy more? Yeah. It's interesting to talk about carbon footprint in the same way.
I like that. I like that way of looking at it. On that conversation we had, we talked about a group of friends getting in a car and car sharing a trip around various drop zones in Europe. Not only are you having a good time, you're actually, with a group of friends, but you're still skydiving, but you're not all traveling halfway around the planet. And something that I'm finding, because I coach a lot of groups and teams all over the planet, and it's ironic that I am flying quite a lot right now. But the reason is rather than a group of 10 of them coming over to see me, which is what used to happen, is they get me to come and see them. And so I'm going to a group, which is another way for them to alleviate some of that impact on the environment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think some of the opportunities maybe aren't as obvious, but when we start doing the math like that, we start to see opportunities. It reminds me of, the one example I was thinking about. I don't know if you know, Pete, if I've told you this, I'm addicted to windsurfing now. That's my
Nice.
my new source of adrenaline and fun now that I'm not skydiving. But I could go to Bonaire in the Caribbean. But if I think about it, again, just in terms of money, like how much is it going to cost me to go there? How much is food going to cost? Lodging for a week? And I could just say in a very practical way, do I want to spend that money? Or do I want to drive 4 hours to the Outer Banks here in North Carolina? And maybe the money that I'll save from not going to Bonaire means an extra week that I don't have to work to earn that money. So instead of taking a week-long windsurfing vacation, I could take a 2-week windsurfing vacation, right? And just the way we can think about, in monetary terms, these things, that's the big takeaway that I got from that one conversation, that one episode, is there's a very calculated way to think about it where we're not saying no to things that we enjoy, but we're making more calculated decisions about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And how was the 2 weeks on the Outer Banks?
I actually have not. That was a hypothetical example.
Well, I'm hoping that you get to do that, Scott. You sound pretty excited talking about it.
Yeah, I have a week planned in October that I'm looking forward to, 1 week. But cool. It did get me thinking. It's interesting how even just that, listening to that YouTube episode and then thinking about, an example of how it would relate to my own fun gave me that idea, right? Of, oh yeah, maybe, how can we calculate this?
Jasper has a really good way of putting things. If you ever get to engage him in some conversation, I like the way his mind works. Yeah.
Yeah, I may reach out to him and ask if he wants to be a guest. Speaking of windsurfing, one thing I've noticed is, especially with board manufacturers, and I noticed on your bio, one of your interests is surfing, so maybe you've seen this too, where windsurf board manufacturers, and I imagine surfboard manufacturers too, are trying to look at the materials that they're using to build these boards. Because, a lot of if you look at a windsurfing board, if you look at a surfboard, they're made out of basically petroleum products. And I know they're talking about something, at least for fins, called bioresin, which is apparently a different type of material they're using to make this plastic-like stuff. Are you exploring anything like that in the skydiving world in terms of, are there different materials that could be used to make the equipment? Is there any talk about that yet?
There is none. I can be absolutely adamant about that. Right now, whenever I've engaged skydiving companies in it, there just is nothing as good as a petrochemical for making the nylon that we need. I mean, silkworms, parachutes were made out of silk back in the day. We would need a lot of silkworms to keep current demand, and we certainly wouldn't be getting the kind of fabrics that we're getting. So to me, that's one of those alleviation things where if we stop the emissions to one side, maybe we can still keep building these things. But the only thing I've seen companies getting involved in is with shipping and with waste management and with energy management around their business. They're trying to take care of that side of things. And some companies more than others. Like I was saying, make a drop zone that is energy and waste efficient, because it's hard right now to do the sport or build the parachute without using petrochemicals.
Yeah. Well, that's, again, the idea is let's do what we can and then keep thinking about the areas that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah.
Getting back to maybe the why of all this, I think for people who don't skydive, it's a little hard to imagine. One of the things I always enjoyed about it and enjoyed about the work I did as a coach and instructor was I always felt like a lot of the people that I coached and taught were gaining confidence from skydiving that would help them in other areas of their life. Like, I'm pretty sure that some of the people I've met who are skydivers were maybe better bosses, maybe better parents, maybe better spouses because of the confidence they gained from skydiving. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that or you've experienced that, but there is that whole aspect of it of, why do we care about skydiving other than the opportunity to advance the technology and create the kind of partnerships that we're talking about. But a lot of these sports, a lot of these activities that we maybe look at as frivolous or fun, really there's an opportunity there for people to learn about themselves, to develop themselves in a very tangible way that has actually a lot of benefits outside of that one activity.
Yeah, that's not something that we see, I think, when we first get into the sport. As you say, we have that that motivation to do something that's a little bit out of the ordinary, or it's a dare from a friend, or it's on the bucket list. But then as we progress through the sport and we realize in order to progress, to move forward with it, we're going to have to break down some barriers, some habits of doing things in a certain way, and really to step fully outside of our comfort zone. For a lot of people, doing that just opens up the mind to, oh, wow, I am capable of doing this. So I would have to agree. I mean, for me, it was a no-brainer. As I said, skydiving was literally in my blood. But it has taken me on a wonderful journey. And more than that, the people that I work with and that you've worked with in the past, you see people completely change their attitude towards the fellow human beings. It seems to, in the case of most people, at least improve their understanding of, like, just looking at the world from that high all day, every day. It does give you a very different perspective, I guess, similar to an astronaut looking at the planet in the distance and going, oh yeah, that's the only one we got. We better start doing something and taking care of the people around us on it as well. So that's an interesting side of what I think any of these sports, and I don't think we need to limit it to skydiving, whether it's windsurfing, surfing, climbing, paragliding, taking us out of our comfort zone and realizing that with training, with mental training, with physical training, with understanding the technological side of it, that we can advance ourselves, which is a bit of a metaphor for what we're talking about in general.
Yeah, that aspect of getting out of a comfort zone, I think, is important, because so much of what we're going to need to do if we want to solve some of these problems we're talking about is going to require people to maybe do things they're not comfortable with, companies thinking about their work in a different way, people thinking about their work in a different way. And maybe there are some lessons to learn, from skydiving about that. I actually had a specific question I was going to ask you, and you may have just answered it, but that's related to all this. So if you've already answered it, that's fine. But the question I thought of was, what made you fall in love with skydiving so much that you're still doing it today after all these years?
Yeah. I always wanted to run away from the gray environment that I felt like I grew up in. I grew up on the outskirts of London, and it wasn't a particularly happy place to grow up in. And I felt like I needed to run away and join the circus. And for me, that circus was skydiving. And it keeps delivering. I mean, first of all, it was an adventurous thing to do. Then it got me traveling around the planet. Then it got me my relationships. It got me in a team environment. It just answered everything that I was looking for. But the actual act still to this day also fills me with joy. I mean, sitting in an aircraft, looking at the planet getting smaller, looking around at the faces of the people you're about to jump with, and working on some tiny details of how we enter the airstream and how we work with the air over our bodies, and then opening our parachutes and then flying them relative to each other. And so there's the human aspect of it, there's a technical aspect of it. And as you can hear, I'm as invested now, if not more, than I was when I was 15 years old. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's a common thread with people who skydive, who stay in the sport for a while, is there is some aspect of being drawn to it by the adventure, or just as a way to escape. I mean, I felt the same way about skydiving when I started. I just loved getting off the planet. I remember I learned to skydive in Florida, and I remember looking down, this is pretty early in my skydiving career, looking down at I think it's I-95 is what I was looking at, and all these people in their cars going to work, and just thinking, all of that looks so small. Everything that's ever bothered me about living on Earth, all the stress, all the problems I've ever had, are just all down there and so far away. And I think was a big appeal to me. But then what we learn about ourselves is so important, right? Like, I remember, again, pretty early, this is when I had maybe 50 jumps. I had this realization about just suddenly something I understood about fear. Like, fear is just our body and our mind's normal response to a situation we're putting it in. It's just like our heart beating. It's just like breathing while you're throwing yourself out of an airplane or getting ready to. Of course you're afraid, and we wouldn't say, oh, it's so terrible, my stomach is digesting my breakfast, right? Well, why should we feel terrible about being afraid? Because it's just normal. Mm-hmm. And then you talked about the people, and just the amazing people we meet in the sport who've had these similar experiences. And yeah, seeing that value. And again, there are so many things I think we're doing that people are doing that we enjoy and that have value. And then, this question we're answering is, how do we still maintain these things that we enjoy and that have value for us? Can we keep doing these cool things while also being more responsible and doing it in a more sustainable way?
Yeah. Do we have to modify our behavior, or can we modify our activity in order for it to fit that? And at the end of the day, like I said, it could be that I end up base jumping and paragliding, and that's it. And we can't find a way. But I'm going to work my hardest to make sure that doesn't happen, for sure.
Yeah. Excellent, Pete. Well, yeah, I'm very excited about what you're doing. I'm going to keep tuning into your YouTube channel. I have a question that I've been asking people in my other podcast at the end of every episode, and I'd like to ask you the same question right now, which is, what is your dream right now?
Well, I have so many. I literally have so many. Understanding myself even better, so that I can do the things that I love to do even better with the people that I want to do them with. Sorry to be kind of vague like that. It's not, I'd love to see sustainable aviation, et cetera, but getting to know myself even more so I can make more use of my time on the planet.
That's wonderful. Man, thank you. Pete, if people want to learn more about what you're doing, are there any links, social media, anything you'd like to share where people can learn more about what you're doing?
Well, the YouTube channel, Future Proof Skydiving. And if you have any ideas or you're part of something you want me to either to give me some information or for me to get into and just find something out, you can contact me via the YouTube channel or on Instagram at XLPete. That would be two good platforms to do that on.
And I will include those links in the show notes so people can find those easily.
Perfect. Scott, it's been a bit like a therapy session for me. You've opened up my mind up to some new areas as well. Thank you so much for the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Pete. It's been great having you as a guest. This has been awesome. Once again, you can check the show notes for this podcast episode for links to Pete's Future Proof Skydiving YouTube channel and to his Instagram. If you enjoyed this episode, tell your friends about us, and remember to like or subscribe or follow us on your podcast player. Or go to our website, creatingacoolerworld.com. You can sign up for a newsletter and learn about new episodes that way. We've got some other great guests and great episodes coming up soon that we think you will enjoy. When I'm not making podcast episodes, one of the things that I do is help people with their time management skills. And if you would like to attend one of my free online time management workshops that I hold every month, go to my website, scottmillercoaching.com. You can find a link there to sign up for the next workshop. Thanks again for listening. Have a great rest of your day. And if you're wondering what my dogs are doing, they were barking at something a minute ago, but they are probably sleeping again by now.